if you're got your materials there handy. I'm dealing with a situation in my eye. Evidently, I was cutting the board today, and since I had the remarkable change of my eyesight, where now I don't have to wear glasses, so I didn't have no glasses on. And sure enough, got some sawdust in my eye, and before I could get it out, it evidently had scratched the surface of my eye somehow, because it don't feel good at all. It feels similar to when I was working in the boiler shop. I got a piece of hot slag in my eye one time, and by the time I got to the doctor, then he said, well, I can see it's burned a little impression there on your eye, and it's rusting around the edges. And so he did my eye, and he had this little machine that sort of like a little grinder of a thing, and he said, now here in about 10 minutes you're going to wish you never came in here. And that was a fact for sure. He said, just hold ice on your eye, and then it'll get better over time. So you'd hold ice on your eye for 10 seconds till it about drove you crazy, and you put the ice down, and about 10 seconds you was back again. That was miserable. So when I sometimes will tell a person they've got something wrong with them, I'll say, I've had worse than that on my eyeball. Well, you know, now I'm ended up having that. So doesn't feel too good, but hopefully we'll get through. And my nose is running because of all the moisture. So just bear with me, if you will, and maybe we'll get through it. We did quite extensively, looking as much as we could in the time frame we're allowed at the Herods, and now we've made our way down to the Samaritans. And keep in mind, of course, the information that we're going to be dealing with here is material that we would not have available to us if we did not know what transpired during this 40-year or 400-year period of time in which God was silent. Because these events that are taking place here give us a background then to the world in which Jesus and the apostles and the early church had to exist in dealing with these individuals and the situations that existed there. Because you know as well as I that if you turn and you're studying the life of Christ, and specifically in John chapter 4, and you see that for some reason, you know, the Jews wouldn't even travel through Samaria. They'd go all the way around. It didn't matter if it take an extra day to travel somewhere to keep from going through Samaria, they would do that because they so despised the people that lived there. Not Jesus, of course. He broke protocol, of course, and lo and behold, if he didn't even have a conversation with a Samaritan woman, caught the Samaritan woman by surprise. Well, why is all that, you know? Now, we maybe have a little bit of an understanding of that. Well, here the information is going to be provided for us that will help us better understand why that attitude existed between the Jews and the Samaritans and the Jews. And also remember, probably one of the most beloved parables that Jesus taught was the Good Samaritan, you know. And of course, in the Jews' way of looking at things, there wasn't no such thing as a Good Samaritan, you know. But yet here's a Good Samaritan that far excels all these other individuals who you'd have thought would have been very hospitable and willing to give of whatever they had. I mean, you got religious leaders, you got a priest and a Levite, but they don't take care of this poor man. But then here's a Samaritan of all things that does. So you think that Jesus was maybe trying to get people to think a little bit outside of what they'd been led to believe from the past. Well, isn't that sometimes a good thing to do, you know? We'd sometimes point out what was the whole argument that existed between the Hatfields and the McCoys, you know? Well, probably many of them that ended up committing murder or were murdered themselves didn't have a clue as to how it originated, you know? But they just knew they hated that family for some reason. Something had happened. And if we're not careful, then we can be guilty of doing the same thing, you know, thinking the same way that's been handed down to us. We don't really know why that is. And I've told you about, of course, talking to the preacher, young fella over at in Chattanooga on Ashland Parkway, or what? Ashland Terrace, yeah, Ashland Terrace, anti-group, you know. And there's this boy, and he didn't really have any understanding as to the history, as to why there was no fellowship that existed between him and other congregations in that area. And so I talked to him a little bit, but never did get much leeway because he was more or less told, don't be spending no time talking to anybody but us, you know, which is a sad thing for sure. So as we get down here to the bottom, look at the origin and a little bit of a brief history of these Samaritans. Oh, me. Excuse me. I may have to get a whole row here for Of course, Samaria was what? Do we know from what is written and what we studied not too long ago in the divided kingdom? What is the significance of Samaria? It is the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. Of course, that came about with the dividing of the kingdom at the leadership, of course, of Jeroboam and then Rehoboam in the south and all that. Well, to have a capital, while there was two specific places that they were supposed to worship at, according to Jeroboam, and that, of course, was at Bethel and at Dan. Then there was a capital city that developed over time. And, of course, capital cities moved from hither and yon, but then finally settled, for the most part, at Samaria. And so Samaria was the capital city of the northern kingdom of Israel. And thus you have all the kings all the way through Ahab and all of the things that were going on during that period of time that were in those cities. And so we know the demise that ultimately happened to the northern kingdom at the hands of the Assyrians, as the Assyrians took the northern kingdom into captivity. And that's around 721 or 722 BC. Well, notice the specific things that are mentioned here. We studied this as well when we were studying the divided kingdom. Many of the Israelites were taken and put in places that the Assyrians had already whooped, you know, and they got territory here. Let's fill it up with Jews, you know. Let's fill it up with the people from the northern kingdom of Israel. And they brought foreigners in that they had defeated as well and put them in Samaria. But we made the observation on Sunday that just because the northern kingdom was carried into captivity doesn't mean that every single solitary person was carried into captivity, because you can hide, or you can be away on a vacation somewhere else, or there's all different types of reasons why there were still those that were descendants of Abraham through Isaac through Jacob still in the northern kingdom, and that figures into the prominence here that we're going to be studying about this evening. Notice it says these people intermarried. That's in letter B there. These people intermarried with the remaining Israelites and became known as Samaritans. And of course, there's our reference from 2 Kings chapter 17. Then, with this quotation from Kelso, who is a historian, he says more likely. Now, of course, that's contrasted with less likely, I guess, you know. And here we're talking about subjective type information because it's not inspired, so you have to look upon it as what some fella has figured out, and he has reasons behind it, of course. He says they were descendants of the Israelites left in the land, for Samaritan theology shows no sign of the influence of paganism among the colonists sent by the Assyrians. If there was intermarriage, the children became true Israelites. Well, the problem with that is that you remember when we were studying the divided kingdom, that one of the reasons why they could not band themselves together as a group is because they were all following their various deities, you know. They were still divided, even though they were in the same locality. They still were lining up and showing allegiance to the various heathen deities from which they came, you know. They had their own national gods, you know, and so they were divided over that. So far from, just because there's by the period of time in which we're talking about here, and at the end of the this 400-year period of silence, that in a general way it seems as though the distinctions are few and far between Samaritan Jews. There is clearly distinctions, and they could not be properly classified as Israelites because they didn't consider themselves Israelites either. So I don't know where he got all his information at, but we'll have more that countermands that here in a few minutes anyhow. After captivity, remember when we talked about this just a little bit, when they were fixing to rebuild the temple, then Samaritans said, "We'll help," and of course, they were not allowed to help. Zerubbabel and Joshua, who was the high priest at the time, would not allow them to participate. And then during that period of time in which the Maccabees were in charge, tradition represents the Samaritans as joining with, that is, those from Syria, the Seleucids, and they became enemies and fought against the Jews during that period of time. So that don't sound like they're Israelites to me, does you? You know, if they're fighting against them, what are they doing fighting with the enemies of the Israelites? Don't make any sense. But nonetheless, that's the idea here. And then, of course, some hatred might have arose due to the fact that John Hyrcanus destroyed the temple in Samaria on Mount Gerizim, and that was in the year 128 BC. So that's not a way in which you're endearing yourself to a group of people if you destroy their temple, even though there was no authority for that temple there to begin with. And so that's not a way for you to actually change their attitude towards you if that's what you're going to do in your nationalistic way of looking at things, which is what he did. And then it says we don't know when the temple was built. And we know that the Samaritan woman at John chapter 4 said, "Our fathers worshipped in this mountain." Now, the emphasis he's making here in this point is that don't mean they still are. But I think that might be drawing a little bit too much from the text, you know. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain. Our fathers still worship in this mountain, you know. Now, all the extravagance that went along at a previous time may not be there, but it's still a place that is looked upon by the Samaritans, and this woman being a representative of the way they thought, as being the place to worship in contrast to Jerusalem. And of course, it was Jesus that said, you know, the time's coming where it's not going to matter where. What's going to matter is the object of worship is going to be the Father, and you're going to have to worship the Father in spirit and in truth wherever you are worshiping. And then on the next page, and of course, you know, some might suspect that there's a little bit of a difficulty in actually saying that's Jacob's well, okay? Archaeologists think that this temple, which the ruins of our own Mount Gerizim, was visible from Jacob's well, you know. Now, how well, did y'all see Jacob's well when y'all went over to the Middle East?
No, we saw Beersheba.
You saw Beersheba? And, of course, I would have been fearful of traveling around much where Abraham dug wells, because remember the Philistines filled them in, and Isaac had to come along and dig them out again, and of course he did that. And I always wondered if how many of them that he did replace, you know, or how many emptied out again in order to avoid war. Isaac did that and stands head and shoulders above the rest in trying to find peace without actually going to war against them. And of course, by the time of the New Testament, obviously from John 4 and verse 9, there were no dealings between the Jews and the Samaritans. Well, what about the religion? Surely there was something, it didn't have anything to do with so much the way they looked or how they combed their hair, but what mattered was their different religion. Now here's some interesting information relative to the distinctions that exist as far as secular history goes relative to their type of religion and what they practiced. Evidently, they went along with the first 5 books of the Old Testament up to a point, you know. Well, we have any problem with the first 5 books of the Old Testament? Well, of course not. Do we live under that law? Well, of course not. But they sought to apply the law given through Moses and all the historical data and the book of Genesis just like any Jew would. But when there's a reference to Jerusalem, then they saw fit to sort of veer off into Gerizim, you know, Mount Gerizim, instead of Jerusalem. So there you have, it reminded me of how that in the Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants and all the so-called holy books, inspired books of Mormonism, you know, it teaches that Jesus was not really born in Bethlehem. He was born in Jerusalem, you know. And, of course, if you ask them about that, they'll say, well, it's close, you know. But Micah does not say Jerusalem. He says Bethlehem Ephratah. He doesn't say close to Jerusalem. Yes?
The Book of Mormon has it that he was born
In Jerusalem.
I asked a couple of young Mormons about it this time. They just talk about the general area.
The general area, yeah, yeah. So, and of course, you know, there's one of those terms that's very subjective, a general area, you know. How general, you wonder. But of course, anytime you have a pre-written history in the form of a prophecy, as is the case with so many events that went right along with the coming of Jesus, then they're already detailed, specific, and not in the general area, obviously. So that's suspect right off the bat by that terminology being used. But that's a dodge, of course, for those that would try to get around a clear contradiction to what the Bible actually says. And then it says here that there are actually some manuscripts, and I thought this is very interesting, and it fits into the field that we don't spend a whole lot of time talking about. But I don't know if you've done any study on the Dead Sea Scrolls or ever heard much said about it, you know. And I know that Kyle Butt and Brother Lyons and others, you know, have written extensively on it and got videos that goes along with it, and how that they simply verify what we know to be the case relative to the Old Testament record. I got to go get me some more. I am so sorry, y'all.
I would guess that the Samaritans too, and after the kingdom divided, they started making their own rules because they didn't want to have anything to do with Jerusalem and Judah, because they was afraid their people would, want to go back to Jerusalem, start worshiping, and then become pretty much, partners with Judah again. Well, the king didn't want that.
Yeah.
The king didn't want that. He wanted them separate.
Yeah, he didn't want them, because when you got more people bound together like that, the more likely they are to try to overthrow those that are over them like that. And of course, that was one of the arguments that Jeroboam had made originally. You know, if we don't come up with an alternative plan to worship, then while we've got them up here up north right now, they'll want to go back down there, because they'll have to go back down there 3 times a year to worship at Jerusalem. And if we don't give them an alternative to the worship of God, then they'll be worshiping God, and they'll pretty soon say, well, if we're worshiping God up here, then why don't we just do the right thing and go worship God down there? And so he devises a system of golden calf worship of all things. So he was thinking about that too. And the amazing thing is, the people were so gullible, they bought into it, That's what's pitiful. It's not that he devised the system. It's the people said, oh yeah, that's good. That's good. Makes it easier on us. We don't have to worry about going back down there. And besides, we might even end up being in the priesthood, even though all these years we've thought that you had to be out of the tribe of Levi, and now we got people that are priests from all the other tribes. So maybe we can rise to the occasion in that area as well. People were willing to do that. And one of the points that's made here and under number 2 is the Samaritans still observe the Passover, and they observe it at Mount Gerizim. So obviously and you don't know what they're thinking at all, but obviously they feel an affinity for the God that provided the law on Mount Sinai through Moses, obviously, and they give high praise to it and seeking to follow by it. And then here's something referred to as the Samaria papyri, a collection of 20 fragments of Aramaic documents discovered by somebody that's wandering around out in the wilderness 9 miles north of Jericho in 1962 to 1964. Now, isn't it amazing that discoveries like this are made, and while some might look upon it as no big deal, then there is some significance to it, because at the same time there are 300 human skeletons that are found in that same cave. So this is a prominent burial ground and a place where they hid some of these ancient documents. Well, what's the big deal about it? Well, the next statement that's made, these writings have added considerable information about the intertestament period. So, if we don't know what all's going on during that period of time, and God is not recording for us what's going on at that time, then from a historical standpoint, here we have added information that tells us what's going on at that time, see? Now, while it's not inspired information, it is information historically beneficial for sure, since there is no other information available except pieces like this and what we have, of course, from other historians at that time. And when these scrolls or these papyri are dated, they date between 375 to 335 BC. Well, now we're getting all the way back nearly to the days of Nehemiah and Ezra and rebuilding the wall around the city of Jerusalem. We're getting close, see? So we're within close proximity of actual inspired documents being found. And so you might expect then there might be some correlation between what we know is written by the inspiration of God and then secular history. When it coincides with that information, you say, of course, that's what you expect. Not a contradiction, but a verifying through secular history just exactly what happened. So you find during that period of time, you got references made to people that at least their family members are mentioned in inspiration, for sure. You got Artaxerxes II, Darius III, and the place the documents just prior to Alexander the Great, of course, invasion in 332 BC. There's also reference to Sanballat, and of course we remember Sanballat from his desire to stop the building of the wall around the city of Jerusalem. But this is not that Sanballat, but it's either a Sanballat that is either a dynastic title or it's a family name that was given to somebody who was a descendant of him. And then notice the quotation from this cross man. Although the people of the city of Samaria initially ingratiated themselves with their foreign ruler, Alexander the Great, they later burned alive Andromachus, Alexander's representative in Syria. The act was not only a heinous crime, it was the first sign of a revolt in Syria, Palestine. Alexander returned in all haste to Samaria, took vengeance on the murderers who were delivered up to him, and according to him, then here's what happened. Alexander destroyed the city of Samaria. Archaeologists have uncovered the late 14th century towers at Samaria, which were built in Greek design rather than Palestinian. So here, not only were you seeing the influence of language and culture, but even the way that buildings were constructed. I mean, just think about it. Here in 300 or 400 years, you know, and people's coming through Sequatchie Valley and they say, seems like everybody's hooked up somehow to Facebook, and it looks like everybody's building their houses according to some of them decorating channels and Pinterest and all that stuff. Isn't that amazing? Everybody's house looks just alike, you know. And of course, it reminded me of a statement I think that Lanny gave, how that people was all getting all excited about what they can make out of what could be made. Was it Lanny? Was it picture frames?
Well, they make stuff out of
Pallets. That's right. Yeah.
This guy took like a wooden bed and tore it down and made a wooden oak pallet.
Yeah, boy, he really fixed that. Yeah. He'd seen that on Pinterest, you know. Pallets are the thing, and so he destroyed a perfectly good bed that's probably ancient, you know, and he made it a pallet, and it's got leaned over against the wall, and people hang their stockings there for Christmas, and everybody loves to have it so. You can see that I'm sort of speaking tongue-in-cheek here. Oh, I am so sorry, y'all. Man. Yes. If I'd have knew, if I'd have,
It don't say it in our paper here, but I look at some of that stuff on the cave. It says those people weren't found like, that wasn't like a vertical cave. Said they can, that's surmise that they went in there and were trapped in there and built a fire and suffocated.
is that right?
There's a couple of things that I had, which I don't,
I mean, that's indeed a possibility. Well, I had to blink it. It's like there's, I don't know, it's like there's a 2x4 up in there, and every time I blink my eye, it's poking into my eyeball. But I've washed it out and everything else, and it's just scratched, I'm pretty sure. But
I was reading about this, it said the Samaritan religion, said they believe they came to live on Mount Gerizim because Moses, in his 10th commandment, ordered them to protect it as a sacred mountain and worship on it by making pilgrimage 3 times a year. And they also thought that that was the place that Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac, so that was, it's like a
that's why it was.
rural site now, they have like a park and everything.
Is that right? At Gerizim. But see, the only thing is, though, is that at no point in the actual Pentateuch do we find Moses designating that place to be anything. I mean, it's Horeb. It's Sinai, you know. No.
In Deuteronomy, it said that, these shall stand upon Mount Gerizim to bless the people, when they're come over from Jordan, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin. So, and then it says on Ebal that they'll curse the other tribes. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? So, there's where it says something about blessing Gerizim.
Yeah. It may be. It may be. And of course, you know, finding a passage and pulling it out of its context and making a big to-do out of it that's not intended is notorious, of course. I mean, you've heard television evangelists, so-called, you know, take a passage out of the middle of Amos and apply it to something happened in South America last week, you know. So see, there it is right there. Here's the newspaper. Oh, wow. It's amazing. And people love to have it so, you know. So, obviously, if you're talking about where God's people were to worship, then there is no doubt but that it was Jerusalem, you know. So, in order to get away from that, then there'd have to be a whole lot of twisting and distorting the Scripture to try to make it somewhere else, you know. But of course, if you're trying to have your own society and have some connection to the God of heaven, then accepting part of the Pentateuch and then all these other things develop, I guess that's to be understood, not justified, but at least that's a reasoning that they would do to try to do that, I guess. And then, of course, the city of Samaria, through the building enterprises of Herod the Great, he made it a great big old important place as well. Spent a lot of money there. And notice in Luke chapter 9, 52 through 56, on point number 3 on page 32, travel in first century Palestine was affected by the Samaritan-Jew conflict. Many Jews traveled along the Jordan Valley or through Perea on their way to Jerusalem. In other words, they would travel extra miles just to keep from having to go through there, you know. Now, I've done that before, you know. I'd go all the way, stay in Pulaski and go all the way down to Tupelo and go all the way down through Louisiana to keep from going through Alabama. You know, I've done that before, you know. No, I ain't done that before. But that's a severe hatred if you don't even travel through there, lest you're liable to spend a dime and they end up making something off of you, you know. But that existed for sure during that period of time. So anytime when you look at the situation we find ourselves in oftentimes with prejudice and all different types of racism and all that, don't ever jump to the conclusion that that's something that originated in our time frame, because that's always been a problem, always been a problem. and it's always been condemned by God. When favoritism is shown based upon something like that a person cannot change anyhow, then that's condemned by God. God's not a respecter of person, and neither are we to be. And then, of course, the last point that's made, which is certainly positive, is that when you get to the 8th chapter of the book of Acts, and you see Philip in the city or in Samaria, and he's preaching, then there's a receptive audience there that hears the gospel preached. Of course, they see the miracles that Philip is performing, of course. And when he preaches Jesus, and he preaches things concerning the kingdom of God in the name of Jesus Christ, then they're baptized, both men and women. Simon, the former sorcerer, obeys the gospel as well. And so even though that animosity exists, and some people say, well, I'm not going to listen to no Jew preach. Well, here they listened to a Jew preach and ended up obeying the gospel and enjoyed the forgiveness of their sins, just like anybody and everybody has to since that day on Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. All right, remember we asked the question, 33, we'll have to pick up there. Actually, on Sunday, I think we're going to be watching the first film strip in our class on Sunday morning from our evangelism seminar that's coming up. We're going to be watching that. All the classes, well, at least teenage classes, I think, up is going to be in here, and we're all going to watch that and sort of set the tone so we can understand a little bit better as to what's going to be transpiring during that seminar. But one of the things that we oftentimes will ask is, and of course I've preached sermons on it, you've heard sermons on it, if Jesus, what was Jesus? What sect was Jesus a member of? He wasn't a member of any sect, was he? Could you say that Jesus was just a Jew? Yeah, that's what you could say, He certainly wasn't a Sadducee, he wasn't a Pharisee, he wasn't a Herodian, he wasn't a zealot, He was just what the law of Moses prescribed for him to be. He lived faithful to the law under which he lived. He was born of a woman, born under the law, and he lived that law perfectly. And so if Jesus in the first century didn't have anything to do with the divided religious world, but yet was approved by God in being just a Jew, then does that principle hold true even today if applied? Well, of course it does, Can a person be just a Christian and not be a part of any man-made religious organization? Well, absolutely, And of course that simple message and that simple point is one that we constantly try to get people just to think about that for a minute, And I mean, I don't know how you could impress it on people's mind any more than, remember one Sunday night I brought all these books in, I had a Book of Mormon, I had orders from headquarters from all these different religious groups, And so Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church, all these different groups. And I said, all right, what if someone was to say, what do I need to do to become a Baptist? And I would say, well, take this Book of Mormon right here, and you study this Book of Mormon. It'll make you the best Baptist. So I said, well, you're crazy. Book of Mormon won't make a Baptist. It won't, will it? No. In order to be a Baptist, then you got to follow the Baptist manual, the rules and requirements of the Baptist church, And the same thing holds true to any religious organization. Well, what if you don't want to be a part of anything? What if you just want to be a member of the church that you can read about in the New Testament? What book would you use there? Book of Mormon? No. You just use the Bible. Use the Bible. And of course, that's led to the obvious conclusion that the Bible only makes Christians only. And the only Christians. You got to have something else to be something else. Just as you had to have something else in addition to the law of Moses in order to be a Pharisee or a Sadducee or a whoever in the first century. Or a Samaritan, see, or even a Samaritan. So that principle is one that at least at one time, that resounded as desires us these things in such a way that you really do have to have help to misunderstand. And that's not the kind of help that we need. we'll have to pick up here, Lord willing, on next Wednesday night, as we look old, and this is available on Netflix, I think, but it's called The Two Popes, I think it's called. And the person that told me I need to watch it, what it is, it supposedly chronicles what transpired, you know, with the retiring of Benedict, or whatever his name is, you know. And then his place was taken by what we've got now, you know, a Spanish-speaking liberal as a pope, you know. And that battle between, you know, structure, what the Roman Catholic Church has always believed, and then this guy. And it's very interesting. And if a person was trying to find a justification for progressivism, which means apostasy, then there it is. You know, there's a perfect example of it happening. Thank y'all so much.